There is a particular kind of silence that exists only between two people who both know something the other one hasn't said yet. This is a story about that silence, about a table with a wobbling leg that nobody ever fixed, about a second cup of coffee that went cold for 2 years for reasons nobody in the cafe ever asked about out loud, and about a man who would spend 14 months watching a woman grieve before he understood that he was not simply watching her story unfold. He had been part of it from the very beginning, long before either of them ever learned each other's names. The espresso machine hissed at 8:47 in the morning, and Daniel Cole did not look up because he already knew who had just walked through the door. He had known for 14 months. He had never needed to check. She always came on Fridays. She always sat at the table by the window, the one with the slight wobble on its left leg that nobody had ever fixed, and she always ordered 2 coffees. 1 black, no sugar. 1 with cream, 2 sugars, stirred exactly 3 times before she set the spoon down on a folded napkin. She drank 1 of them. The other one she left untouched until it went cold, and then, at exactly 10:15, she would gather her coat, leave a $10 bill under the saucer, and walk out without once looking back at the table. Daniel had wondered about the second coffee for 400 and some Fridays. He had never asked. Asking felt like reaching into a room that wasn't his to enter, and Daniel Cole, 36 years old, a man who had spent the last 3 years rebuilding a life out of very careful, very deliberate silence, understood something about rooms that weren't his to enter. He understood it better than almost anyone who had ever poured a coffee for a stranger. Her name, he had learned only because she'd once given it to the cashier before he started working mornings, was Elena. Elena Marchetti. He did not know her last name would matter later. He did not know, that particular Friday in early October, that anything at all was about to change. He only knew that the second coffee had gone cold again, the way it always did, and that something about the stillness of her hands around the first cup made him set down the rag he'd been using to wipe the counter and walk toward her table before he had fully decided to do it. He had never done this before.
He did it anyway.
"Do you mind if I sit?" She looked up. Her eyes were a shade of gray-green that seemed to hold more weather than color, and for a moment she looked at him the way a person looks at a door they've walked past 1,000 times and never once tried to open. "It's a free country," she said. It wasn't a yes. It also wasn't a no, and Daniel, who had learned the difference between the two more painfully than he would ever explain to a stranger, chose to hear it as an invitation. He sat. The second coffee sat between them, cooling, untouched, the cream forming a faint skin across its surface, and neither of them mentioned it, which was, in its own way, the loudest thing in the room. Elena Marchetti had a rule about Fridays, and the rule was this: she did not miss them. Not when it rained so hard the gutters overflowed onto Marchetti Street 2 years ago, and she'd walked 6 blocks with a broken umbrella just to sit in the same chair for 90 minutes. Not when she had the flu so badly in February that her roommate begged her to stay in bed, and she went anyway, wrapped in 2 scarves, drinking her coffee through chattering teeth. Not even the Friday after her mother's funeral, when everyone assumed she would finally, mercifully, let herself skip one. She had gone that day, too. She had ordered the same 2 coffees. She had sat in the same chair. She had told no one why, because there was no way to explain the rule to someone who hadn't lived inside the reason for it, and the reason for it was the only thing in Elena's life she had never once said out loud to another living person. She worked as a structural engineer for a firm that designed bridges, which she found, in her quieter moments, to be almost cruelly appropriate. She spent her days calculating how much weight a thing could bear before it failed, how much tension could travel through steel before steel remembered it was not permanent, and she went home every night to an apartment that held exactly 1 photograph, turned slightly away from the door so that she would not have to see it every time she walked in. She was 33 years old. She had not been on a date in 2 years and 4 months. Her friends had stopped asking why sometime around month 8, not because they'd stopped wondering, but because the last time someone asked, Elena had gone quiet in a way that made everyone at the table wish they hadn't. She was by every external measure moving forward. She had a promotion. She had a gym membership she mostly used. She had, twice, deleted a dating app the same night she downloaded it. She was not moving forward. She was orbiting something, the way a planet orbits a star it can never touch and can never leave, and the orbit had a schedule, and the schedule was Friday, 8:47 in the morning, the table by the window, 2 coffees, one of which she would drink and one of which she would not. Her closest friend, Priya, had tried, more than once, to gently suggest that the ritual had outgrown its usefulness. "It's been 2 years, Elle," Priya said over dinner one Tuesday, the kind of dinner where the wine had loosened something honest in both of them. "I'm not saying forget him. I would never say that. I'm saying I think you've built a shrine out of a coffee order, and I worry that the shrine is the only room you let yourself live in anymore." "I don't need you to understand it," Elena said. "I need you to let me have it." "I do let you have it," Priya said. "I've let you have it for 2 years. I just love you enough to keep asking if it's still helping, and lately, I'm not sure the answer is yes." "You've never done that before," she said, once he was settled across from her. Once the silence had stretched just long enough to become a question in itself. "Sat down? Talk to me." "I talk to you every Friday," Daniel said. "I say good morning. I say here's your coffee. I say have a good one." "That's not talking," Elena said. "That's transaction." He had no answer for that because she was right, and being right so immediately and so precisely made something in him want to know what else she noticed that other people missed. 14 months, he said instead. "That's how long you've been coming in on Fridays." "I know because I started in August the year before last, and you were already a regular by then. So it's been longer than 14 months. That's just how long I've been the one pouring it." Elena's hand tightened slightly around her cup. "You count," she said. It wasn't quite an accusation. "Everyone counts something," Daniel said. "Some people count calories. Some people count money. I count the things that stay the same when everything else doesn't." He hadn't meant to say that much. It had come out before he'd checked it, the way certain truths do when they've been waiting a long time for a door to open even slightly. Elena studied him for a moment that lasted longer than either of them would have admitted. "What made you sit down today?" she asked. "Not last Friday. Not the Friday before that. Today." Daniel looked at the second cup, the one going cold, the cream skinning over on its surface like something quietly closing. "Your hands," he said. "What about them?" "They were shaking. Just a little. And you were holding the cup so tightly, I thought you might crack it. I've watched you sit in that chair for over a year, and I've never once seen your hands shake." Elena looked down at her hands as though they belonged to someone else, someone she was only now being introduced to. "It's a hard day," she said. "Which one?" She looked up sharply, and for a moment Daniel thought he had gone too far too fast, had reached into the room before he'd earned the key. "I don't know you," she said. Not cruelly. Carefully, the way a person tests ice before deciding whether it will hold their weight. "No," Daniel agreed. "But I've been watching you order the same thing for 14 months, and today your hands are shaking, and I decided that mattered more than staying behind the counter. You can tell me it's none of my business. You'd be right." Elena didn't tell him that. She told him something else instead, something smaller, something that felt to her like handing a stranger the corner of a much larger map without showing him where the map led. "It would have been our anniversary," she said. 6 years. Daniel didn't ask who our belonged to. He understood, with the particular clarity of a man who had learned to read the weather in other people's silences, that the second coffee had an owner, and that the owner was the reason for everything. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it more than the words could carry. "Don't be," Elena said. "You didn't do anything." That sentence would come back to both of them later, in a different room, in a different season, meaning something entirely different than either of them understood it to mean that morning. Neither of them knew that yet. The second coffee went cold, the way it always did, and at 10:15 Elena stood, left her $10 under the saucer, and this time, for the first time in 14 months, she looked back at the table before she walked out the door. Daniel was still sitting there. He was still watching the second cup. He didn't sit with her the next Friday.
He almost did.
He stood behind the counter at 8:44, watching the door the way he had never let himself watch it before, and when she walked in at 8:47 exactly, on time, always on time, he felt something in his chest tighten in a way that made him angry at himself for feeling it at all. He poured her coffee. He poured the second one. He set them both down. "Thank you," she said, and there was something in the way she said it, something searching, that made Daniel wonder if she had been hoping he would sit again and was disappointed that he hadn't, or hoping he wouldn't and relieved that he didn't. He genuinely did not know which. He suspected she didn't either. He gave her the space. He told himself it was respect. It was partly respect. It was also fear, the specific kind of fear that belongs to a man who has learned, the hard way, exactly how much damage can be done by getting close to something fragile and beautiful and already broken in a way he cannot see from the outside. He watched her from behind the counter instead. He watched the second cup go cold. He watched her leave at 10:15, and this time, she looked back at the table twice. He counted. He was aware with a kind of quiet horror that he had started counting things about her the way she counted the things that stayed the same. He did not examine that thought very closely. Examining it felt dangerous, like turning over a stone in a garden and finding something living underneath that he wasn't prepared to name yet. His manager, a heavy-set man named Ozzy who had owned the cafe for 11 years and noticed everything that happened inside it whether or not he commented on it, caught him watching the door that second Friday and said only, "You're going to burn the croissants standing there like that." Daniel had not been standing anywhere near the croissants. "Just tired," he said. Ozzy didn't push it, but he watched Daniel for the rest of the shift with the particular patience of a man who had seen every version of this story before, behind this same counter, over 11 years of pouring coffee for people who came in carrying things they never once explained. That night, Daniel called his brother Marcus, not on the usual Sunday schedule, 3 days early, which was itself unusual enough that Marcus answered on the first ring instead of the third. "Everything okay?" "Yeah," Daniel said. "I don't know. There's this woman who comes into the cafe every Friday." "The one you've mentioned twice in 3 years?" Daniel hadn't realized he'd mentioned her before. He supposed he had in passing, the way you mention whether you've stopped noticing because it's simply always there. "She's grieving someone," Daniel said. "Really grieving. The kind that doesn't go away on a schedule. And I think I might be starting to feel something for her, and I don't know what to do with that because I don't think I'm supposed to be feeling anything for anyone. Not after everything." Marcus was quiet on the other end for a moment, the specific quiet of an older brother deciding how much honesty a conversation could hold before it broke something. "You've been punishing yourself for 2 years, Danny," Marcus said finally. "Kessler Street wasn't your fault. You did more than anyone would have. You don't owe the universe a sentence of solitary confinement for having been the one who stopped." "That's not what this is, isn't it?" Daniel didn't answer that, because he didn't have an answer that felt true yet, and some questions, he had learned, needed to sit unanswered for a while before the answer arrived on its own. It was the Friday after that, the third Friday, when she asked him to sit down before he'd even set the cups on the table. "You're allowed to talk to me," she said. "I decided that last week. I just needed the week to decide it." Daniel sat. "Okay," he said. "Talk to me about what?" "Anything that isn't the coffee." So he told her about the bookstore 2 blocks from the cafe where he spent most of his Sunday afternoons, not buying anything, just reading the first 3 chapters of books he had no intention of finishing, because he liked beginnings more than he liked endings, and had for longer than he could explain. He told her he had grown up in a house 40 minutes outside the city with 2 brothers who still called him every Sunday night at 7, without fail, a ritual none of them had ever discussed or agreed to, one that had simply continued since their father died, as though stopping it might mean losing something none of them were ready to lose twice. He didn't tell her about the accident. Not yet. There would be a Friday for that, eventually, though neither of them knew it yet, and when it came, it would not arrive gently. Elena told him about bridges, about the specific, deeply satisfying mathematics of tension and compression, of knowing exactly how much a structure could bear, and exactly where it would fail if you asked more of it than it was built to hold. She told him this the way some people talk about a language only they speak fluently, and Daniel, listening, understood that she was not really talking about bridges at all. She was talking about herself. He didn't say that out loud. He filed it away instead, the way he filed away the second coffee cup and the shaking hands and the two backward glances, building a picture of a woman he was beginning to suspect he could love before he had any real right to. That thought terrified him more than anything had in 3 years. By the 6th Friday, they were no longer strangers who happened to share a table. They were something new, something without a name yet, something that lived in the specific hour between 8:47 and 10:15 and nowhere else, because neither of them had suggested meeting anywhere beyond it. Neither of them had suggested it because both of them, for entirely different reasons, were afraid of what it would mean to let this thing exist outside the boundaries of a single hour on a single day. For Elena, the boundary was protection. If it stayed inside the hour, inside the cafe, inside the ritual she had built around a memory she couldn't release, then it couldn't grow into something that competed with that memory. It could exist alongside it. It could not replace it. For Daniel, the boundary was something closer to penance, though he would not have used that word yet, would not have let himself examine why some quiet, persistent part of him believed he did not deserve more than an hour of anything good. "Tell me about him," Elena said on the 6th Friday, out of nowhere, the way people ask the biggest questions when they've finally built up enough nerve and can't wait one more day to spend it. "Who?" "Whoever it is you're not telling me about. You do the thing where your hand goes still every time an ambulance passes outside. You did it twice today." "I've been counting." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Counting," he repeated. "Look at you. Don't deflect." He looked at his hands, the same hands that had gone still twice that morning without his permission, without his notice even, until she had pointed it out and made him aware of a habit he had spent 3 years pretending he didn't have. "Not today," he said. "That one's not a today conversation." Elena studied him for a long moment, and something in her expression softened into recognition, the particular recognition of someone who understood exactly what it meant to have a story that required its own careful unveiling, its own Friday, its own right moment that hadn't arrived yet. "Okay," she said. "I'll wait." She did not know, yet, how much waiting that promise would eventually cost her. Neither did he. Priya noticed the change before Elena admitted it to herself. "You're humming," Priya said, the Tuesday before the 7th Friday, watching Elena chop vegetables in her own kitchen with an ease that hadn't been there in over a year. "I'm not humming. You've been humming for 10 minutes. You hum when something good is happening and you haven't figured out how to feel guilty about it yet." Elena set down the knife. "There's a man at the cafe," she said, finally, the sentence arriving smaller and more fragile than she'd intended. "He's the barista. We've been talking. Just talking. On Fridays." Priya's eyebrows rose slowly, carefully, the way a friend's eyebrows rise when they are trying very hard not to make a moment bigger than the person sharing it wants it to be. "How long is just talking? 6 weeks.
Al.
"I know. Do you like him?" Elena picked the knife back up, mostly so she'd have something to look at that wasn't Priya's face. "I think I might," she said. "And I don't know what to do with that, because liking him feels like it's happening in the same room where I still order Thomas's coffee, and I don't know if those two things are allowed to exist at the same time." "Why wouldn't they be?" "Because it feels like cheating on a memory," Elena said, and saying it out loud made it sound both smaller and heavier than it had felt in her head. "Which I know doesn't make sense. Memories don't get cheated on. But grief doesn't run on logic, Priya. It runs on whatever rule it invented for itself 2 years ago, and I've never been brave enough to ask if the rule still applies." Priya crossed the kitchen and put both hands on Elena's shoulders, the specific gesture of a friend who has been waiting a long time for permission to say something directly. "Thomas would want you humming," she said. "I only met him a handful of times, but I remember exactly the kind of man he was, and he was not a man who would want you to spend the rest of your life ordering coffee for a ghost instead of letting yourself be warm again." Grief doesn't owe anyone a life sentence, Elle. Not even love that big. Elena didn't respond to that, not directly, but she thought about it for the rest of the week, turning it over the way she turned over stress calculations at work, looking for the point where the structure might fail, and finding, to her quiet surprise, that it held. The seventh Friday, it rained the way it had rained 2 years earlier when Elena walked 6 blocks with a broken umbrella, and Daniel watched her come through the door soaked to the shoulders, her hair plastered to her forehead, and something in him moved before his mind caught up to it. He met her at the table with a towel from behind the counter, something he had never done for another customer in 3 years of working there, and she took it without a word and pressed it to her face, and when she lowered it, her eyes were wet in a way that had nothing to do with rain. "It's the day he died," she said, before Daniel had asked anything at all. "Not the anniversary of us. The anniversary of him. 2 years today." Daniel sat down slowly. "You don't have to tell me," he said. "I know," Elena said. "I'm going to anyway. I think I've been waiting 14 months for someone to ask, and you're the only one who ever has, even though you never actually asked." Outside, the rain kept coming, streaking the window beside their table, blurring the street into something soft and formless, and inside, at a table with a wobbling leg that nobody had ever fixed, Elena Marchetti began to tell a stranger the story she had never told anyone, in a version she had never once said out loud, not to her mother before she died, not to her closest friend, not to the grief counselor she had seen exactly 4 times before deciding she preferred to carry it alone. "His name was Thomas," she said. "We were supposed to get married in the spring. We met at this cafe, actually. Not this table. The one by the door, back when it still had the corner booth before they remodeled. He used to come in every Friday morning before work, and I used to come in every Friday morning before work, and for 2 months, we just sort of nodded at each other over our coffees before he finally asked if he could sit down." Daniel felt something cold move through his chest, a recognition he could not yet name, a shape he could not yet see clearly enough to be afraid of. "That became our thing," Elena continued. "Fridays. Even after we moved in together, even after the ring, even after everything else in our lives got complicated and busy and real, Fridays stayed simple. Fridays stayed just us, this table, 2 coffees, 30 minutes before work started for both of us. It was the 1 hour of the week that belonged only to us." "What happened?" Daniel asked quietly, though some part of him already understood the shape the story was about to take. The way you understand a storm is coming before the first drop falls, from the pressure in the air alone. "He was coming to meet me," Elena said. 2 years ago today. It was raining like today, actually, and he was 3 minutes from here, and there was a truck that ran a red light on Kessler Street, and she stopped." She had told this part before, technically, to her mother, to the police, to the grief counselor she saw 4 times, but she had never told it the way she was telling it now, slowly, with all the weight still attached to every word, because she had never before told it to someone who was, at that very moment, looking at her the way a person looks at something they are terrified of understanding too completely. "He didn't make it to the hospital," Elena said. "He didn't make it here. He didn't make it anywhere except a stretch of Kessler Street that I have not been able to drive down in 2 years without my hands shaking on the wheel." The second cup, the one that always went cold, sat between them. "I keep ordering his coffee," she said. "I don't know why exactly. I've asked myself that question for 2 years, and I've never landed on an answer that felt complete. I think some part of me believes that if I stop ordering it, I'm agreeing that he's not coming. And I'm not ready to agree to that. I don't know if I'll ever be ready to agree to that." "What was he like?" Daniel asked, gently, because he understood in that moment that the kindest thing he could offer her was not comfort but curiosity, the specific gift of wanting to know a person who could no longer introduce himself. Elena's face did something complicated, grief and warmth arriving together the way they sometimes do when someone finally gets to talk about a person they love without being managed or handled or protected from their own memories. "He fixed things," she said. "Not just objects, though he did that too, obsessively. Our apartment was full of half-repaired lamps and chairs he swore he'd get back to. He fixed situations. If two of our friends were fighting, he'd find some quiet way to ease it without either of them realizing he'd done anything at all. He used to say the best kind of help was the kind nobody noticed you giving. She paused, something catching briefly in her throat. He would have liked that about you, I think. If he'd ever gotten the chance to know you were the one who stayed. Daniel didn't trust himself to respond to that yet, some private weight of it settling into his chest before he understood why, and Elena, mistaking his silence for simple compassion rather than the beginning of a recognition he was not yet ready to name aloud, continued. He proposed at this table, she said, and gestured faintly toward the surface between them, worn smooth by years of elbows and coffee cups and mornings just like this one. Not the exact table, we're a few feet from the old corner booth, but close enough. He'd hidden the ring in the bottom of my coffee cup, wrapped in wax paper so it wouldn't get wet, and I nearly swallowed it before I noticed. She laughed, briefly, the specific laugh that arrives uninvited in the middle of grief and surprises the person laughing more than anyone listening. That's the last truly happy memory I have of this place before everything after, she said. And I think that's part of why I keep coming back. Not just to grieve him. To stay close to the version of this room where he was still here to fill it. Daniel reached, without entirely deciding to, and set his hand near hers on the table, not quite touching, leaving the choice of the last inch to her. Thank you for telling me, he said. All of it. I know it isn't easy handing someone a room that big. I don't know why I told you, Elena admitted. I've never told anyone the proposal part. Not even Priya knows about the wax paper. Maybe you needed someone new to hand it to, Daniel said. Someone who didn't already have their own version of that memory attached to it. He did not yet know how wrong and how right that sentence actually was. Daniel did not say anything for a long moment, because there was nothing he could say that would not sound impossibly small against the size of what she had just handed him, and because something else, something he could not yet look at directly, had begun moving beneath the surface of his own carefully maintained silence. Kessler Street. 2 years ago. Rain. He knew that street. He knew that intersection. He knew, with a certainty that made his hands go cold in a way Elena had not yet learned to recognize, exactly what had happened there 2 years ago, because he had been the one who called it in. He said none of that. Not that Friday. I'm so sorry, he said instead, and it was true, and it was also the smallest fraction of everything he was suddenly, unbearably feeling, and Elena, who had spent 2 years learning to read the difference between comfort that meant something and comfort that was only performance, looked at him and saw something in his face she could not name yet. She would name it later. It would break something in her when she did. For 3 more weeks, Daniel said nothing. He told himself it was timing. He told himself she had just relived the worst day of her life and did not need, on top of it, the added weight of learning that the man across from her had been present for the final minutes of it, had knelt on wet asphalt and held a stranger's hand and heard 3 words meant for someone he would not meet for 2 more years. He told himself all of this, and some of it was even true, but underneath the reasons he could defend to himself was a reason he could not yet defend, which was that he had begun to fall in love with her, entirely, completely, in the specific and dangerous way a person falls when they have spent 3 years believing they no longer had the capacity for it, and he understood, with a dread that sat behind his ribs like a stone, that telling her the truth might cost him the only good thing that had happened to him since Kessler Street had taken something from him too. He had never told anyone what happened that night. Not his brothers, who called every Sunday at 7. Not the therapist he'd seen twice before deciding, like Elena, that some things were easier carried alone. He had told the police what they needed for the report. He had told no one the rest. The rest was this. He had been driving home from a late shift at a different cafe, the one he'd worked before this one, when he came around the curve on Kessler Street and saw the wreckage already gathering its small, grim audience of strangers, hazard lights strobing red and gold across the wet pavement, and he had done what he always did in moments that asked more of him than he felt equipped to give. He had gotten out of the car. The truck driver was already out too, standing several feet back, phone shaking in his hand as he tried to explain something to the 911 operator that his own voice kept failing to form into words. Another car had stopped behind Daniel's, its headlights washing the scene in a pale, indifferent glow, its driver frozen behind the wheel, unwilling or unable to get any closer. Daniel had not thought about it. That was the part he would replay for 2 years afterward, the absence of deciding, the way his body had simply moved toward the wreckage before his mind had finished registering what it was moving toward. The man was still breathing when Daniel reached him, folded at an angle no body was built to hold, one hand caught in the twisted metal of the driver's door, the other free, reaching for nothing, finding nothing, until Daniel took it. "Hey," Daniel said, kneeling into the rain, into water that had already gone the wrong color where it pooled beneath them. "Hey, I've got you. Help's coming. I can hear the sirens. Stay with me, okay?" The man's eyes had found his, unfocused at first, then sharpening with a terrible, lucid urgency, the specific clarity that sometimes arrives in the last minutes a person is left, as though the body concentrates everything it is toward one final task before it lets go of everything else. "Ring," the man said. His voice was barely a voice at all, more breath than sound. "Tell her. Ring's in the drawer. The one on her side. She doesn't know." "I'll tell her," Daniel said, not knowing who her was, not knowing anything except that a promise was the only thing he had to offer. "I promise I'll tell her. What else?" "Tell her I'm sorry," the man said. "I was late. I'm always. Tell her I was trying to get there." "I will. Tell her I love her." The grip on Daniel's hand tightened, briefly, with whatever strength was left to spend. "Tell her I still love her." Tell her he had not finished. His eyes had stayed open, fixed somewhere past Daniel's shoulder, past the rain, past whatever remained of the world close enough to reach, and by the time the paramedics arrived, sirens finally cutting through the wet dark, there had been nothing left for them to do but confirm what Daniel already understood, kneeling there with a stranger's blood cooling against his palm. Daniel had stepped back into the rain once the paramedics took over, and then, 3 days later, unable to explain why, unable to explain anything about that night to anyone including himself, he had found an obituary with a name he recognized only by the description beneath it, and driven to a florist, and left a bouquet of white ranunculus on a doorstep with no note, no name, no explanation, because he had no idea how to hand a grieving woman the words her dying fiancé had given a stranger, and had told himself for 2 years that some kindnesses were better left anonymous. He had never learned her name, until Elena said it, on a rainy Friday, across a table with a wobbling leg, and told him a story that ended on a street he had never been able to drive down again either. The 8th Friday arrived without rain, without confessions, without anything that announced itself as significant, and it became, in its own quiet way, one of the most important mornings either of them would remember. "Tell me something you've never told anyone," Elena said, turning her cup slowly on its saucer. "That's a big request for a Friday morning. You started it. Weeks ago. All those small things you kept handing me a little at a time. I want a bigger one." Daniel considered this for a long moment, watching the steam rise off his coffee, deciding how much of himself he was willing to set down on a table that had already held so much of hers. "I used to want to be a paramedic," he said finally. "Before the cafe. Before any of this. I did 2 years of the training. I quit 6 months before I would have finished." "Why?" "Because I was good at the calm part," Daniel said. "The staying steady when everything around you is falling apart. I was good at that in the classroom, in the simulations. But there was a call during my clinical rotation, a kid, maybe 9 years old, and I froze. Just for a few seconds. My supervisor covered for me, and the kid was fine in the end, but I never forgot those few seconds where my whole body just stopped working the way it was supposed to. I told myself I wasn't built for it. I walked away instead of finding out if that was even true. And now you make coffee. And now I make coffee," Daniel agreed. For 3 years, I told myself that was the safer choice. Nobody dies from a bad latte. But then Kessler Street happened, Elena said quietly, though she did not yet know the shape of what that meant. Not fully. Not for 2 more Fridays. And you didn't freeze that time. Daniel looked at her, something unreadable moving behind his eyes. No, he said. That time I didn't freeze at all. Neither of them understood, in that moment, how much weight that sentence was carrying, how much it would mean in 2 weeks when the rest of the story finally arrived. Elena simply reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, briefly, the first time either of them had touched on purpose rather than by the accident of reaching for the same napkin, and said only, I think whatever you're not telling me yet, it's going to turn out that you were exactly where you were supposed to be. She had no idea how true that sentence would turn out to be. Neither did he. On the 9th Friday, Elena arrived early, at 8:31 instead of 8:47, 16 minutes ahead of the schedule she had never once broken in 2 years, and what she saw through the cafe window stopped her hand on the door. Daniel was standing close to a woman near the counter, a woman with dark hair and an easy, familiar laugh, his hand resting briefly on her arm in a gesture that looked, from 16 feet away and through rain-streaked glass, exactly like the kind of gesture 2 people share when they have history neither of them needs to explain. Elena stood on the sidewalk for 11 full seconds, feeling something cold and unfamiliar tighten in her chest, a feeling she did not have a name for yet because she had not allowed herself to feel jealousy over anyone in 2 years, and had forgotten, in the meantime, how quickly and how completely it could arrive. She almost turned around and walked home. She didn't. She pushed the door open instead, and the bell rang, and Daniel looked up, and whatever had been sitting easily between him and the dark-haired woman rearranged itself instantly into something more formal, more careful. Elena, Daniel said. This is my sister-in-law. Priya's opposite in every way, believe me. Jules. Marcus's wife. She stopped by to drop off my niece's birthday invitation. Jules smiled, unbothered, entirely unaware of the 11 seconds Elena had just spent standing outside deciding whether to walk away from something she had only recently allowed herself to want. He talks about you, Jules said, gathering her coat. More than he thinks he does. She left. The bell rang again behind her. Elena sat down at the table, her heart still catching up to a conversation that had already resolved itself, and said nothing about the 11 seconds, though something in her had learned, in that small, unnecessary scare, exactly how much she had already come to care. Daniel noticed the shift in her that morning and didn't understand it, filed it away as one more piece of a woman he was still learning to read, one more small mystery among many, not knowing that the mystery had already solved itself before she'd even sat down, not knowing how close she had come to leaving without either of them ever learning why. He almost told her on the 10th Friday. He had rehearsed it. He had stood in his apartment the night before, saying the words out loud to an empty room, trying to find the version of the sentence that would not sound like a confession disguised as comfort, that would not sound like he had been keeping something from her for weeks while she poured her whole broken heart onto a table between them. There was no version like that. Every version sounded exactly like what it was. He sat down across from her that Friday with the sentence loaded and ready, and then Elena smiled at him. Actually smiled, wide and unguarded in a way he had never once seen in 14 months of watching her from behind the counter, and said, I ordered 1 coffee today. Daniel looked at the table. 1 cup. I didn't decide it beforehand, Elena said, and her voice had a wobble in it that matched the table leg, something unsteady and brand new. I got up to the counter, and I just said 1 coffee, and it felt like betraying him, and it felt like breathing for the first time in 2 years, both at once, and I don't know what to do with feeling both those things so completely at the same time. Daniel's rehearsed sentence dissolved somewhere in his throat. He could not tell her now. Not today. Not on the day she had, for the first time in 2 years, ordered 1 coffee instead of 2, a decision that had clearly cost her something enormous, a decision that was, whether she understood it yet or not, about him. I think, Daniel said carefully, that you're allowed to feel both things. I don't think one cancels the other. I think that's just what moving forward actually looks like. Nobody tells you it's supposed to hurt this much on the way through. Elena looked at him for a long moment, something shifting behind her eyes, something that had been circling for weeks finally landing. I like you, she said. I've liked you for a while now, actually longer than I've been willing to admit, and I don't know what to do with that either, because liking you feels like it's built on top of something I haven't fully told you yet, and I don't know how to hand you the rest of it without you looking at me differently. Daniel's stomach dropped in a way that mirrored her sentence almost exactly, a strange, aching symmetry neither of them yet understood. There's more, he said. Not quite a question. There's more, Elena agreed. But not today. Today I ordered one coffee, and I want to just sit here and let that be the whole thing for a while, if that's okay. That's okay, Daniel said, and meant it, and hated himself a little for how relieved he felt, because relief meant one more week of silence, one more week of the growing distance between what she believed about him and what was actually true. They sat with a single cup between them for a long while after that, neither of them in a hurry to fill the silence, and at some point Elena reached across and turned the coffee cup slightly, the way she had once turned Thomas's spoon 3 times before setting it down, an old habit her hands performed without asking permission from the rest of her. Do you think it's strange, she asked, that the version of grief nobody warns you about is the guilt of feeling okay again? Everyone prepares you for the sadness. Nobody prepares you for the specific shame of laughing at something and realizing, a half-second later, that you laughed without thinking of him first. I don't think it's strange, Daniel said. I think it might be the most human thing there is. Grief doesn't ask permission to loosen its grip. It just does, eventually on its own schedule, and I think the guilt is just love trying to keep up with a pace it wasn't ready for. Elena looked at him for a long moment, something warm and unguarded moving behind her eyes. You say things like that sometimes, she said, and I forget you're the man who pours my coffee for a living. I contain multitudes, Daniel said, and she laughed, actually laughed, a full unguarded sound that turned the head of the woman at the next table, and Daniel thought, watching her, that he would trade almost anything he owned to keep hearing that particular sound for the rest of his life. He did not yet know how close he was to losing the chance to. He did not know that her more and his more were about to become the same story, told from 2 directions, meeting in the middle like 2 ends of a bridge, closing the final gap before the load-bearing test that would determine whether the whole structure could hold. The night before the 11th Friday, Daniel did not sleep. He sat in his apartment with every light off except the small lamp by the window, a habit that had nothing to do with saving electricity and everything to do with a comfort he'd built for himself in the dark 3 years ago and never quite let go of, and he thought about the specific arithmetic of what he was about to risk. He had, for 11 weeks, been given something he had not let himself believe he still deserved, a person who looked forward to seeing him, a person whose face changed shape slightly, softened, when he sat down across from her. He understood that whatever he said tomorrow could take that away permanently, could recast every one of those 11 Fridays as something built on an omission so large it swallowed the rest. He called Marcus at 11 at night, which had never happened before in either of their adult lives, and Marcus, to his credit, did not ask why before answering. I think I have to tell her everything tomorrow, Daniel said. About Kessler Street, about the flowers, all of it. Do you want my honest opinion? No, Daniel said. But give it to me anyway. You should have told her the day she told you about the accident, Marcus said. Not because you did anything wrong by staying quiet that first day. Grief needs its own room to breathe before you crowd it with more information. But you've had 11 weeks since then, Danny, and I think some part of you has been hoping the right moment would arrive on its own so you'd never have to be the one who chose it. Daniel didn't answer that because it was true, and hearing it said aloud by someone who loved him made it harder to keep pretending otherwise. Tell her tomorrow, Marcus said. Not because it'll definitely go well. It might not. But you've spent 3 years treating penance like it's the same thing as love, and I don't think it is, Danny. I think real love tells the truth even when the truth is expensive. Especially then. Daniel sat with that until the sky outside his window began, faintly, to lighten, and when he finally arrived at the cafe the next morning, he had not decided on a perfect version of the sentence. He had simply decided he was done waiting for one. The 11th Friday, Elena told him the rest. "The flowers," she said, before he'd even set the coffee down. "I need to tell you about the flowers because I've never told anyone this, and I think I need to say it out loud to someone who might understand why it mattered so much." Daniel sat, his pulse already climbing, some part of him already understanding where this was going before she said another word. 3 days after Thomas died, Elena said, "Someone left flowers on my doorstep. White ranunculus. No note. No name. I asked everyone. His mother said it wasn't her. My mother said it wasn't her. None of our friends claimed it. I never found out who it was, and for 2 years, that mystery has been the strangest, smallest comfort I've had. This idea that somewhere out there, a stranger cared enough to do something kind and ask for nothing in return, not even to be known." Daniel's hands beneath the table had gone completely still. "I used to imagine who it might have been," Elena continued, her eyes distant now. Somewhere in a memory Daniel understood far better than she could possibly know. "Sometimes I imagined it was someone from his work, someone too shy to sign a card. Sometimes I imagined it was one of the paramedics, someone who'd seen something in him worth honoring beyond the job. I never landed on an answer. I just held on to the not knowing like it was its own kind of gift." "What if you found out?" Daniel said slowly, each word feeling like a stone he was placing on a bridge he was no longer sure would hold his weight, that the person who left them wasn't a stranger to the story, that he was actually part of it, that he'd been there, that night, before the flowers, before any of this. Elena went very still.
"Daniel," she said.
"What are you telling me?" He told her. He told her about the late shift, the curve on Kessler Street, the rain, the hazard lights strobing red and gold across wet pavement. He told her about kneeling beside a man he did not know, holding a hand that was losing its grip on the world, staying because staying was the only thing he knew how to offer someone in that particular kind of dark. He told her about the 3 unfinished sentences, the ring in the drawer, the apology for being late, the words that never quite finished themselves before the ambulance arrived and took over what little time was left. He told her about the obituary, 3 days later, the description that matched the man on the wet asphalt too precisely to be anyone else, and the flowers he'd left with no note because he had no earthly idea how to hand a grieving stranger her fiancé's last, unfinished sentence. Elena did not move through any of it. She sat with her hands wrapped around a coffee cup she had, for the first time in 2 years, ordered alone, and she listened to a man she had begun, quietly and against every instinct of self-protection she'd built since Kessler Street, to fall in love with, tell her that he had been there at the exact center of the worst night of her life, and had said nothing for 2 years, and then had said nothing for 11 more Fridays after that, watching her grieve across a table from him while carrying the one piece of the story that might have changed everything she believed about how it ended. Elena's cup sat forgotten between her hands, gone cold now in a way that mirrored, without either of them noting it aloud, the second cup that had gone cold every Friday for 2 years. "Why didn't the police tell me any of this?" she asked, her voice strangely level, the specific flatness of someone holding an enormous feeling perfectly still so it doesn't spill before she's ready. "There probably wasn't a reason to," Daniel said. "I wasn't family. I wasn't hurt. I gave a statement, they took my number in case they needed a follow-up, and that was the end of my part in an official sense. Nobody writes down what a stranger says while he's holding your hand. There's no form for that. So, I could have gone my whole life never knowing you existed. Yes. And you decided on your own, 2 years ago, that was the better outcome." "I decided," Daniel said, "that I didn't have the right to hand a grieving stranger her fiancé's last words without a name attached, because a name felt like it demanded something back from you, some acknowledgement, some relationship to a night you'd probably have rather forgotten. I thought Anonymous was kinder. I see now that I might have been protecting myself as much as I was protecting you. I don't think I understood that distinction back then. I think I understand it now, sitting here, watching your face do what it's doing. What is my face doing? Deciding whether you can still trust anything I've told you the last 11 weeks. Elena looked at him for a long moment, and something in her expression was not quite anger and not quite forgiveness, but the narrow, uncertain space between the two, the place where most real reckonings actually happen. Say it, she said, very quietly when he finished. Whatever the last thing he tried to say was. Say it to me now. Daniel closed his eyes. Tell her I love her, he said. Tell her I still love her, tell her. His voice broke on the last word, the same place Thomas's voice had broken 2 years earlier, holding on to a sentence neither of them had ever been able to finish. He didn't finish it, Daniel said. I've carried that unfinished sentence for 2 years, and I never knew what to do with it, because there was no way to hand it to you without also handing you everything else, and I was afraid, I'm still afraid, that everything else would be too much. That you'd look at these 11 Fridays and only see a lie. Elena was crying now, quietly, the specific quiet crying of someone who has been given something enormous and does not yet know if it is a gift or a wound. You knew, she said. This whole time. Every Friday. You sat across from me knowing exactly what happened on that street, knowing what his last words were, and you let me talk about the mystery of the flowers like it was some sweet, unsolved thing, and it was you the entire time. Yes, Daniel said. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Because I didn't know how to, Daniel said, and because somewhere in these 11 Fridays, I stopped being the man who was there that night and started being someone who mattered to you on his own, and I was terrified that telling you the truth would erase that. That you'd only ever be able to see me as the stranger from Kessler Street again. Not as the person you said you liked 3 weeks ago, at this exact table. The rain outside had stopped at some point during his confession, though neither of them had noticed, the window clearing slowly into a gray, washed-out morning light that felt entirely too gentle for what had just happened between them. I need to think, Elena said, standing, her chair scraping against the floor with a sound too loud for the silence it broke. I need you to not message me. I need you to just let me have some time. Okay, Daniel said, though every part of him wanted to reach across the table and hold on to something he suspected he had just lost by finally telling the truth. She left without her coffee that day. For the first time in 14 months, the second cup went cold without her ever having touched it at all. Elena did not go home after she left the cafe. She sat first in her car outside for nearly 20 minutes, hands on the wheel, not driving anywhere, running one thought over and over in a loop she couldn't quiet. What if he's wrong? What if he's telling me a story he's convinced himself is true because he wants so badly to belong to it? What if this is grief finding a stranger to attach itself to, the way her own grief had attached itself to a second cup of coffee for 2 years? She drove to the record office instead of home, the one downtown that still handled requests for old incident reports, and stood at the counter feeling faintly ridiculous, a grieving fiancé demanding to confirm the identity of the man who had knelt beside her dying partner 2 years earlier, as though love could be authenticated the way a document could. The clerk found it within minutes. A single paragraph, buried in the technical, bloodless language such reports are always written in, noted that a bystander, a Daniel R. Cole, had been first on scene, had called it in at 7:52 that evening, and had remained with the victim until paramedics arrived 4 minutes later. Elena stood in the record office with the paper in her hands and felt something break open that she had been holding rigid since the moment Daniel had said Kessler Street out loud. It was not relief exactly. It was something more complicated, something closer to the specific vertigo of watching two separate, private griefs discover they had been standing in the same room the entire time without either of them knowing it. She walked, for almost 2 hours after that, through streets she normally avoided and found herself, without entirely deciding to, standing outside the small blue house where Thomas's mother, Margaret, still lived alone with a garden she had let go slightly wild since her son's death, as though tending it too carefully might mean accepting that he was never coming back to see it bloom. Margaret opened the door before Elena had finished deciding whether to knock. "You look like you've seen something," Margaret said, the specific bluntness of a woman who had buried enough of her own softness 2 years ago to no longer bother softening her observations for anyone else. Elena told her everything, standing in the doorway at first, and then sitting in the kitchen over tea neither of them drank. The whole story, the flowers, the barista, Kessler Street, the 3 unfinished sentences carried by a stranger for 2 years before he'd found the nerve to hand them back. Margaret was quiet for a long time after Elena finished. "I always wondered about those flowers," she said finally. "I used to think maybe it was one of his coworkers. Or someone from the hospital who'd taken a liking to him in whatever those last minutes were." She turned her teacup slowly on its saucer, an old habit Elena recognized because Thomas had done the same thing, unconsciously, at this same table, at holidays, for the 6 years she'd known him. "I don't think this is a betrayal, if that's what you came here needing me to say." "I don't know what I came here needing," Elena admitted. "I think you came here because some part of you already knows you're going to forgive him," Margaret said, "and you needed someone who loved Thomas as much as you did to tell you that's allowed." "So I'm telling you, it's allowed, Elena. My son spent his whole life collecting people who needed somewhere safe to land. It doesn't surprise me at all that the last thing he did with his life was ask a stranger to keep something safe until it could find its way to you. That's exactly who he was. I would be more surprised if it had happened to anyone else." Elena cried in that kitchen in a way she had not let herself cry in 2 years, not the careful, contained crying she performed for coworkers and acquaintances, but the full, shaking kind that comes from a body finally given permission to stop holding something so tightly. She did not decide anything that day. She only understood, walking home in the last gray light of a Friday afternoon, that the anger she had been carrying for 6 days was not actually anger at Daniel. It was grief again, wearing a new shape, the way grief sometimes disguises itself as fury when it has run out of other ways to make itself known. She did not come back the next Friday. Daniel stood behind the counter at 8:47, watching the door the way he had watched it for over a year, and the door did not open, not for her, not that morning, and something in his chest understood, with a specific and total finality, exactly how much he had risked and exactly how much he might have already lost. He did not text her. He had promised he wouldn't, and it was one of the only things he had left to offer her, the simple, unglamorous act of keeping his word when everything else about the last 2 years had apparently been built on a silence he hadn't kept for the right reasons. She did not come the Friday after that either. 2 Fridays became 3. 3 became 4. Daniel kept working the morning shift, kept wiping down the table by the window with its wobbling leg, kept setting out 2 coffees on instinct before catching himself and correcting to 1, an old habit that took its time dying, and every Friday he told himself this might be the week, and every Friday the door opened for other people, and never for her. He thought about the second cup, cold and untouched on the day she found out the truth. He thought about the way she had looked at him, not with hatred exactly, but with something more complicated, the specific vertigo of discovering that a story you had lived inside for 2 years had a second half you never knew existed, one that rearranged everything that came before it. He understood, in the quiet hours of those 4 empty Fridays, that he had done something that could not simply be apologized away. He had let her fall for him without telling her the one thing that might have changed how she understood the falling. It didn't matter that his reasons had been born from fear rather than cruelty. It didn't matter that some part of the silence had been protecting her as much as protecting himself. It had still been a silence she hadn't chosen. Priya came over on the 4th Friday of Elena's absence, uninvited, carrying takeout Elena hadn't asked for and wasn't sure she wanted, and sat on the couch across from her with the specific patience of someone prepared to stay as long as it took. "You've watched the same 3 episodes of that cooking show 4 times this month," Priya said. "I've been counting." "Everyone's counting something," Elena murmured, and didn't explain the reference. though something in her chest ached faintly at borrowing Daniel's own words without meaning to. "Do you love him?" Elena didn't answer right away. She looked at the window, at the gray evening light settling over the street, and thought about 11 Fridays, about a table with a wobbling leg, about a man who had kept a dying stranger's hand warm in the rain, and then spent 2 years trying to figure out how to give away the words that hand had left behind. "I think I loved him before I knew what he'd done," she said finally. "And I don't know how to separate that from what I feel now. Everything's tangled together. The grief and the gratitude and the anger and whatever this is underneath all of it that just wants to see him again." "Then maybe it isn't supposed to be separated," Priya said. "Maybe it's supposed to just be complicated for a while, and you're allowed to walk toward him anyway, complications included. Nobody gets a clean version of love, Elle. You of all people should know that by now." Elena didn't answer that night, but she thought about it for 2 more weeks, turning it over the way she turned over load calculations, waiting for the point of failure that never arrived. He wrote her a letter on the 5th week, because texting felt too easy to delete, too easy to leave unread, and some things he had learned deserved the weight of ink on paper, deserved to exist somewhere permanent whether or not she ever opened it. He did not know if she would. He left it with the cafe's cashier, an envelope with her name on it, and told her only to give it to Elena Marchetti if she ever came back in on a Friday, and then he waited, the way Elena had once waited, without knowing if the waiting would ever be rewarded. The letter said, in part, "I am not writing this to convince you of anything. I don't think I have the right to convince you of anything anymore. I'm writing it because I think you deserve to have the truth in a form you can put down and pick back up whenever you're ready for it, instead of only having it in the shape it took the last time we spoke, which was too fast and too heavy and not fair to either of us. I have thought every day for 2 years about the 3 sentences I never got to finish handing back to you. I told myself the flowers were enough. I told myself that giving you the rest, the part where I knelt in the rain and held on until it was too late to hold on any longer, would only give you a new wound instead of closing an old one. I understand now that this was a decision I made for you, without asking you, and that it was not mine to make. I am sorry for that specifically, more than I am sorry for anything else in this whole complicated story. I do not regret sitting down at your table. I do not regret a single Friday since. If you never want to see me again, I will understand it as the fair and reasonable outcome of a silence I chose to keep for far too long. But if there is any part of you that still wants to sit across from me at that table with the wobbling leg, I will be there every Friday at 8:47, the way I've been for over a year, whether or not you ever walk through the door again." Elena had read that last line 11 times before she finally folded the letter and slept, for the first time in 6 weeks, without the specific restlessness that had followed her since the rainy Friday she'd learned the truth. She came back on the 6th Friday. Daniel was in the back when the bell over the door rang at 8:47 exactly, and he did not need to look to know it was her. The same way he had never needed to look in 14 months of Fridays before this one, some part of him having learned the specific weight of her footsteps against the old wooden floor. He came out from the back anyway, because some things deserved to be witnessed directly, and found her sitting at the table by the window, the envelope from 6 days earlier open in front of her, the letter itself folded back along its creases, as though she had read it more than once. "I read it 11 times, she said, before he could say anything at all. I counted. Something in Daniel's chest loosened slightly at that, the small mercy of hearing her count again, the way she had always counted the things that mattered. "I don't expect you to forgive me," Daniel said, sitting down slowly, unsure if he had earned the chair yet. "I wrote that in the letter, but I want to say it to your face too. I don't expect it. I just wanted you to have the truth in a form you could sit with as long as you needed to." "I've spent 6 weeks being angry at you," Elena said. "I want you to know that first before anything else. I've been furious. Not just at the silence. At the timing. At the specific cruelty of finding out that the man I'd fallen for was also the man kneeling in the rain on the worst night of my life, and that he'd let me talk about the mystery of the flowers like it was a lovely unsolved thing, week after week, when he was the whole answer sitting right across the table.
I know, Daniel said.
You have every right to that anger. You still do. I'm not asking you to let it go on my schedule. But Elena said, and something in her voice shifted, the way weather shifts, imperceptibly and then completely. I also spent 6 weeks trying to be angry at the actual thing you did, specifically, and not just the shape of it. And here's what I kept arriving at, over and over, no matter how many times I tried to talk myself into staying angry. She unfolded the letter fully, smoothing it flat against the table. You didn't have to kneel down that night, she said. You could have called it in and stayed in your car. Most people would have. You didn't have to hold his hand. You didn't have to listen to 3 unfinished sentences from a dying stranger and carry them for 2 years, waiting for a chance to give them to someone you didn't even know yet. You didn't have to leave flowers with no note, asking for nothing, not even to be known. Every single thing you did that night, and every Friday after it, was a choice to give more than the moment required of you. The only thing you got wrong was not knowing how to hand me the rest of it sooner. And I understand that. I do the same thing. I've been doing the same thing for 2 years, ordering a dead man's coffee because I didn't know how to tell anyone that grief doesn't leave when you're ready for it to. It leaves when it decides to. Daniel felt something break open in his chest, something that had been held rigid and defended for 6 weeks, maybe for 2 years, maybe longer than that. I fell in love with you before I found out who you were to that night, Elena continued, her voice steadier now, finding its own new shape. That part didn't change when you told me the truth. If anything, it got more complicated in a way I'm still working through because now I don't just love you. I'm grateful to you. In a way that's tangled up with grief I haven't finished carrying, and I don't fully know how to separate those two things yet. But I don't want to separate them by leaving. I tried that for 6 weeks. It didn't work. What do you want instead? Daniel asked, very quietly, the way a person asks a question they are afraid to hear answered wrong. Elena looked at the second cup, still sitting there, untouched, the one Daniel had poured out of old habit before catching himself, and, for the first time in 2 years, she reached across and pulled it toward herself instead of leaving it to go cold. She drank from it. I want to finish the sentence, she said. The one he never got to. Not because I'm choosing you over him. Because I think some sentences don't get finished by the person who started them. Sometimes they get finished by whoever's still standing at the end, still willing to stay in the room. She reached across the table and took Daniel's hand, the same hand that had held a stranger's hand on a rain-soaked street 2 years earlier, the same hand that had left flowers with no note, the same hand that had poured her coffee every Friday for 14 months before finally sitting down across from her. Tell her I love her, she said softly, finishing the sentence herself, the words landing in a room they had been circling for 2 years, finally arriving exactly where they needed to be. Tell her I still love her. Tell her that love doesn't end just because the person carrying it does. It just goes looking for somewhere else to land. Outside, the morning light had cleared entirely, the way it sometimes does after rain that has finally run its course, and inside the cafe, at a table with a wobbling leg that nobody had ever fixed, 2 people who had found each other by way of an ending neither of them had chosen sat with 2 cups of coffee between them, both of them warm now, both of them being drunk, both of them, finally, belonging to the people actually sitting at the table. I want to do something we've never done, Elena said, once the coffee was finished, once the silence between them had settled into something calmer than either of them had expected it could. What's that? Leave the cafe together. On a day that isn't Friday. Somewhere that has nothing to do with any of this. They went to the small park 3 blocks from the cafe that following Sunday, a place neither of them had ever mentioned to the other before, and it struck both of them, walking the gravel path beneath trees just beginning to turn, how strange and how ordinary it felt to simply exist together outside the boundaries of a single hour they had built an entire fragile world inside of. I don't know how to do this part, Daniel admitted, watching a dog chase a ball across the grass. The part where it's not confined to a table and a schedule. I've spent 3 years making my whole life very small, and very controlled, and I don't actually know what it looks like to let someone all the way in."
"Neither do I," Elena said.
"I've spent 2 years making Friday the only day I let myself feel anything at all. I don't know what a Tuesday looks like when it's allowed to matter too. So we figured out." She agreed, and there was something in the ordinary shape of that sentence, no confession attached to it, no grief, no revelation, simply two people agreeing to build something new together one uncertain day at a time, that felt more significant to both of them than almost anything that had come before it. They sat on a bench near the pond for a long time after that, not saying much, watching the light shift through the leaves, and Daniel found himself thinking that this specific, unremarkable Sunday afternoon was the thing he had been most afraid he no longer had the capacity to want. He had been wrong about that for 3 years. He was glad, sitting there, to finally be corrected. They did not rush anything after that Friday. Elena had learned, across 2 years of grief, that the things worth keeping were rarely the things that arrived quickly, and Daniel, who had spent 3 years believing he did not deserve anything good arriving at all, was in no hurry to test whether this particular good thing was real by racing toward it faster than it could hold. They spent the following spring the way new couples are supposed to spend a season, learning each other's smaller habits, the ones too minor to mention in a single dramatic confession but large enough to build an actual life on top of. Daniel learned that Elena hummed under her breath when she was doing structural calculations she enjoyed, the same tuneless private hum Priya had once caught her doing in her own kitchen. Elena learned that Daniel could not sleep with any light in the room at all, not even the small red glow of a phone charger, a habit he never fully explained, and she never fully needed him to. He told her, eventually, about Marcus and the Sunday phone calls that had continued every week since their father died, and she began joining them sometimes, quietly, learning the rhythms of a family that had absorbed loss the same slow, patient way hers had. She told him, in turn, about her own father, who had left when she was 9 and never called on any day of the week at all, and about the particular ache of loving someone as reliable as Daniel, when reliability itself had once been the thing she trusted least in the world. Margaret came to dinner in June. She brought a photograph of Thomas at 17, grinning behind the wheel of his first car, and set it on Elena's kitchen counter without asking permission, the way mothers sometimes claim small pieces of territory in the lives of people they've decided to keep. "He'd have liked you," Margaret told Daniel, studying him over a glass of wine with the same directness she'd used the day Elena showed up on her doorstep. "Not everyone would have knelt down. Most people keep driving." Daniel didn't have an answer for that. He had never known how to accept gratitude for the worst night of someone else's life, and he suspected he never fully would, but he let the words sit in the room instead of deflecting them, which was, for a man like him, its own kind of progress. In August, 3 months before the wedding, Elena asked Daniel to take her to Kessler Street. She had not been able to drive down it in 2 years. She had rerouted her entire life around that single stretch of road, adding 11 minutes to her commute rather than past the intersection, and she understood, sitting across from Daniel one evening, that she did not want to marry him with that avoidance still quietly shaping the map of her days. "Are you sure?" Daniel asked, and she could hear, underneath the question, his own private dread of returning to the one place he had spent 3 years trying not to think about too directly either. "No," Elena said. "But I want to go anyway."
"With you."
"I think it might mean something different if we go together instead of me going alone and you going alone, the way we've both apparently been doing separately for 2 years." They went on a Tuesday evening, deliberately not a Friday, wanting the day itself to hold no other weight than the one they were choosing to give it. The intersection looked, when they arrived, almost aggressively ordinary, a stretch of asphalt like any other, cars moving through it in a steady, unremarkable rhythm, nothing marking it as the place where a life had ended and, in its own strange way, another had quietly begun. Daniel stood where he remembered kneeling. Elena stood beside him, her hand finding his without either of them deciding to reach for the other first. "I used to think if I never came back here," Elena said, "some part of him would still be here waiting." which doesn't make sense. I know it doesn't make sense. But grief has its own logic, and mine said if I stayed away, nothing would have to be finished. I used to think the same thing, Daniel admitted. That if I never drove this way again, I could keep some version of that night unfinished too. Like not returning meant I hadn't fully let it happen. They stood there together for a long while, saying very little else, and at some point Elena crouched down and set a single white ranunculus, purchased that morning from the same florist Daniel had visited 2 years earlier, at the edge of the curb, not as a memorial exactly, but as something closer to a period at the end of a very long sentence. Okay, she said, standing, brushing off her knees. Okay. I think I can drive this way now. They walked back to the car together, and neither of them looked back at the intersection again, not because they were avoiding it, but because they had, finally, both of them, together, said everything to it that needed saying. They were married the following autumn, in a small ceremony neither of them wanted to make into anything larger than the moment required, and Elena chose to have it catered by the same café, where a wobbling table by the window had held more of her history than any other single piece of furniture in her life. Ozzy insisted on making the coffee himself that morning, a task he had not personally performed behind that counter in over 4 years, and when Elena asked him why, he only shrugged and said, "Some tables earn a little ceremony." Marcus gave the toast. He talked about his brother's habit of counting things that stayed the same and said that for the first time since their father died, Daniel had found something that stayed not because it never changed, but because both people inside it had chosen, over and over, to keep choosing it. Priya cried through the entire ceremony and did not apologize for it once. Daniel still works mornings there. He still knows, without needing to check, exactly who has just walked through the door. Elena still comes in on Fridays, though the ritual has changed its shape the way rituals sometimes do when the reason for them widens instead of disappearing entirely. She orders one coffee for herself and one for Daniel, who sits down across from her now without asking permission, because permission stopped being necessary somewhere around the 11th Friday, when the truth finally became larger than the fear of telling it. Sometimes, on the anniversary of the accident, she still orders a third cup. She lets it go cold on purpose, the way she used to let the second one go cold for 2 years, and Daniel never asks her to explain it, because some rituals aren't meant to be explained. They're meant to be witnessed. 3 years after the wedding, their daughter was born on a Friday, a detail neither of them had planned and both of them noticed immediately, lying together in the hospital room in the small gray hours of the morning, while the rest of the world outside kept moving through its ordinary Friday routines, unaware that something new had just arrived inside it. They named her Wren, a name that belonged to neither Thomas nor anyone else specifically, a name they had chosen simply because they liked the sound of it, a small quiet insistence that not everything in their life together needed to be built from what came before it. Some things, Elena had come to believe, were allowed to simply be new. Margaret visits every few months now, and she keeps a small photograph of Thomas on the mantel in Elena and Daniel's living room, not hidden away, not turned toward the wall the way the old photograph in Elena's apartment once had been, but placed openly among photographs of Marcus and Jules and their kids, of Priya at the wedding, of Wren's first birthday. One life folded honestly into the shape of another instead of standing apart from it. Daniel still counts the things that stay the same. He has simply widened over the years what he allows onto that list. Marcus's Sunday calls. Ozzy's insistence on burnt croissants being someone else's fault. The particular sound Elena makes when she's solving a problem she's enjoying. The specific weight of his daughter's hand around one of his fingers. And once a year, on a rainy morning in October, at a table with a leg that still wobbles slightly, two people who found each other because of a street neither of them could ever fully leave behind sit together in the specific, complicated grace of a love that began as grief, and grief that ended, quietly, as love. The table by the window still wobbles. All these years later, Ozzy offered, more than once, to finally fix it. Elena always says no. Some things, she has learned, are more valuable slightly unsteady than perfectly repaired, A small daily reminder that the most important structures in a life are rarely the ones that never shift under pressure. They are the ones that hold anyway, weight after weight, Friday after Friday, for as long as somebody is willing to keep sitting down. If someone in your life has ever shown up for you without asking anything in return, without needing to be thanked, without needing to be known, say their name below. Just their name. Some of the most important people in our lives never introduce themselves as anything more than a stranger who happened to kneel down when everyone else kept walking.